What would you say to a man who threatened to derail the most important military operation in human history just weeks before it was set to begin? In the cold, rain-soaked spring of 1944, as Allied forces prepared for Operation Overlord, the audacious cross-channel invasion of Nazi-occupied France, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower faced exactly this crisis. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, the brilliant but maddeningly arrogant British commander who would lead all ground forces during the initial assault on Normandy, had begun raising objections to fundamental aspects of the invasion plan that had taken months of painstaking coordination between American, British, and Canadian forces to construct. The stakes could not have been higher. Failure meant prolonging the war indefinitely. Success meant the beginning of the end for Hitler's Third Reich. But Montgomery, fresh from his victory over Rommel at El Alamein in North Africa and his successful campaign up the Italian peninsula, believed his tactical genius gave him the authority to demand changes that many feared would unravel the entire operation. Eisenhower, relatively untested commander thrust into the most politically sensitive military position imaginable, had to navigate not just military strategy, but the treacherous waters of Allied politics, where Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin watched every move, where American and British national pride hung in the balance, and where the wrong word to Montgomery could fracture the alliance itself. The confrontation that followed would reveal the true nature of leadership under impossible pressure, and Eisenhower's response would echo through military history as a masterclass in diplomatic firmness. What he said, and how he said it, would determine whether the Western Allies presented a united front to Hitler or descended into the kind of infighting that had paralyzed military coalitions throughout history. If this story has already gripped you, imagine what else you'll discover as we go deeper into this crucial moment that shaped World War II and the world we live in today. Make sure you subscribe to this channel so you never miss these untold chapters of history. Hit that like button to help others find this story. Share this video with anyone fascinated by leadership under fire, and drop a comment telling us what aspect of the D-Day preparations you find most compelling or what you never knew. About Eisenhower and Montgomery's relationship. The tension between Eisenhower and Montgomery had been building since December 1943, when Montgomery was appointed to command the 21st Army Group, which would oversee all ground forces during the initial phase of Overlord. The original invasion plan, known as the Cossack Plan after its chief architect Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, called for a three-division assault on a relatively narrow front along the Normandy coast, with the attack scheduled for May 1944. Montgomery reviewed this plan at his headquarters and immediately declared it inadequate, arguing that 3 divisions were insufficient and that the invasion front needed to be expanded from approximately 25 miles to nearly 50 miles. He wanted 5 divisions in the initial assault, with appropriate increases in airborne troops to secure the flanks. Eisenhower, who had been named Supreme Commander in December 1943, actually agreed with Montgomery's assessment. The original plan was indeed too conservative and risked concentrating forces in a way that would make them vulnerable to German counterattack. The problem was that Montgomery's expanded plan required substantially more landing craft, ships, and resources at a time when these were already stretched desperately thin across multiple theaters of war. The invasion had to be postponed from May to early June to accumulate sufficient vessels, a delay that risked better weather turning worse and potentially compromising operational security, as thousands of troops remained in staging areas across southern England. But Montgomery wasn't finished with his demands. By April 1944, with the invasion now set for early June, he began questioning the command structure itself, the allocation of reserves, the timing of the armored division's deployment, and even the strategic objectives of the initial breakout from the beachhead. At SHEF headquarters, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, in Bushy Park outside London, Eisenhower's staff watched with growing alarm as Montgomery seemed determined to refight battles that had already been settled through exhausting compromise between American and British commanders. The fundamental problem was one of personality and philosophy as much as military strategy. Montgomery was a meticulous planner who believed in set-piece battles where overwhelming force was concentrated at decisive points, where nothing was left to chance, and where the commander maintained tight control over all elements. His experience in the desert and Italy had reinforced his conviction that wars were won by commanders who refused to attack until every advantage was secured, every supply line established, every contingency planned for. Eisenhower, by contrast, was a coalition manager who understood that in a vast operation involving multiple nations, services, and personalities, perfection was impossible, and that the art of command lay in balancing competing demands, maintaining alliance unity, and accepting calculated risks. His background was not as a combat commander. He had never led troops in battle before being elevated to theater command in 1942, but as a staff officer and coalition builder, skills that proved invaluable in holding together an alliance where British and American military cultures, strategic priorities, and national sensitivities were in constant friction. Montgomery saw Eisenhower as a political general, too concerned with keeping everyone happy and lacking the ruthless focus required for military victory. Eisenhower saw Montgomery as a talented but temperamental prima donna, whose brilliance was undermined by an inability to see beyond his own narrow tactical preferences to the broader strategic and political imperatives that governed coalition warfare. By late April 1944, as the final pre-invasion conferences approached, this fundamental incompatibility threatened to explode into open conflict. Montgomery had submitted a series of memoranda questioning aspects of the plan, requesting additional resources that didn't exist, and suggesting command arrangements that would effectively subordinate American forces to British direction in ways that were politically unacceptable to Washington. Something had to give, and Eisenhower knew that if he appeared weak or indecisive, the entire command structure could unravel. The crisis came to a head at St. Paul's School in London on May 15, 1944, at the final major pre-invasion conference, where all senior commanders reviewed the complete Overlord plan before King George VI, Churchill, and the assembled military leadership of the Western Alliance. Montgomery presented the ground plan with his characteristic confidence, describing how British and Canadian forces would seize on the invasion's eastern flank, while American forces secured the western flank and drove toward Cherbourg to capture that crucial port. But during the discussion period, Montgomery began raising objections again, questioning the adequacy of air support, the coordination between naval gunfire and ground advance, the timing of armor deployment and reserve allocation. He spoke of grave concerns and insufficient resources in a way that suggested the plan might be fundamentally flawed. Eisenhower, sitting in the front row, felt the room's tension rise. Churchill's face darkened. He had his own doubts about Overlord and didn't need Montgomery feeding those doubts. American commanders like Omar Bradley and George S. Patton exchanged glances, wondering if the British were getting cold feet. The political implications were staggering. If the ground commander expressed lack of confidence in the plan just 3 weeks before the invasion, how could the operation proceed? Eisenhower faced an impossible choice: support Montgomery and validate his concerns, potentially requiring another round of plan revisions that would delay the invasion further and might make it impossible to launch in 1944 at all, or slap Montgomery down publicly, risking the British commander's resignation or sullen non-cooperation and creating a command crisis that would delight Hitler and Stalin alike. After the conference concluded, Eisenhower requested a private meeting with Montgomery at his headquarters. What happened in that room would determine the fate of the invasion and reveal the essential character of both men under the most extreme pressure imaginable. We've reached the heart of this story, where one conversation would determine whether the greatest amphibious invasion in history would proceed with a unified command or descend into the kind of national rivalry that had crippled military coalitions for centuries. If you're finding this deep dive into command decisions fascinating, take a moment to subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from history's most critical moments. Smash that like button to support this content. Share this video with history enthusiasts, military professionals, or anyone who needs to understand what real leadership looks like. And leave a comment about whether you think Eisenhower or Montgomery had the better approach to the invasion or what surprised you most about their relationship. Eisenhower began the private meeting not with recriminations, but with a question. What exactly did Montgomery need to feel confident in the plan? This was classic Eisenhower, turning confrontation into problem-solving. giving his subordinate room to explain rather than forcing him into a defensive position. Montgomery, perhaps surprised by this approach, laid out his concerns more specifically than he had in the public forum. He worried that insufficient air support would leave his forces vulnerable during the critical first hours ashore, that inadequate naval gunfire preparation might mean troops landing against intact German defenses, that the timing of armored division deployment might leave infantry exposed, and that unclear reserve allocation might prevent rapid exploitation of success or containment of German counterattacks. These were legitimate tactical concerns, but Eisenhower recognized them for what they really were: the anxieties of a commander who had tasted defeat early in the war during the British evacuation from France in 1940, and who was determined never to send men into battle without overwhelming advantages. Eisenhower responded with a combination of firmness and reassurance that would become his trademark approach to managing difficult subordinates. He acknowledged Montgomery's tactical expertise and the validity of some concerns, but he made absolutely clear that the fundamental plan would not change, that the invasion would proceed in early June as scheduled, that resources had been allocated as fairly as possible given competing demands across all theaters, and that Montgomery's job was not to second-guess the entire operation, but to execute his portion of it with the forces and support assigned to him. Then came the crucial moment. Eisenhower asked Montgomery directly whether he had confidence in the plan and in his ability to execute his mission. If the answer was no, Eisenhower would find another ground commander, even at this late hour, because he would not launch the invasion with a senior commander who lacked confidence. The risk of relieving Montgomery 3 weeks before D-Day was enormous. It would create a political firestorm in London, might force postponement of the invasion, and could permanently damage Anglo-American relations. But Eisenhower understood that the alternative was worse: proceeding with a commander who might hesitate at the crucial moment or whose lack of confidence might infect the entire operation. Montgomery, confronted with this ultimatum, backed down. He assured Eisenhower that he had complete confidence in the plan and would execute it to the best of his ability. But Eisenhower wasn't finished. He made clear that while Montgomery commanded ground forces during the initial phase, this was a temporary arrangement, and that Eisenhower himself would assume direct command of ground forces once the beachhead was established and American armies were ashore in strength, a point that Montgomery had been trying to blur in his communications. Eisenhower also reminded Montgomery that air and naval forces were not under his command but operated under their own commanders in coordination with ground operations, and that Montgomery needed to work cooperatively with Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory and Admiral Bertram Ramsay rather than treating them as subordinates. These clarifications established boundaries that Eisenhower would enforce throughout the campaign, preventing Montgomery from expanding his authority beyond what the alliance would accept. Then Eisenhower delivered the statement that would define his command philosophy and his relationship with Montgomery for the rest of the war. He told Montgomery that he valued his tactical expertise and aggressive spirit, that he had confidence in Montgomery's ability to lead the ground assault, but that Montgomery needed to understand that this was a coalition operation where political considerations were inseparable from military ones, where maintaining alliance unity was itself a strategic objective, and where no single commander's preferences, no matter how brilliant, could override the collective needs of the Allied cause. He said that if Montgomery could not operate within these constraints, then Montgomery was the wrong man for the job, and should say so now. But if Montgomery accepted the assignment, then Eisenhower expected loyal, enthusiastic, and cooperative execution, without further attempts to relitigate settled questions or undermine the command structure through back channels to London or public expressions of doubt. Montgomery left that meeting chastened and, according to his own later accounts, impressed by Eisenhower's firmness. The British field marshal would continue to be difficult throughout the campaign. His slow advance toward Cannes after D-Day, his resistance to Eisenhower's broad front strategy, his disastrous Market Garden operation in September 1944, and his behavior during the Battle of the Bulge would all create friction with Eisenhower and American commanders. But he never again challenged the fundamental command structure or threatened to derail operations through public expressions of doubt. Eisenhower's confrontation had established clear boundaries and demonstrated that the Supreme Commander, despite his conciliatory nature and political skills, possessed a steel core that would enforce discipline when necessary. The invasion proceeded on June 6, 1944, with Montgomery commanding British, Canadian, and American ground forces during the assault. Despite terrible weather, fierce German resistance, and setbacks on Omaha Beach that nearly led to disaster, the Allies established their foothold in France. Montgomery's meticulous planning and tactical skill contributed significantly to the success of the initial landings, even as his cautious advance afterward frustrated Eisenhower and American commanders, who wanted more aggressive exploitation of the breakthrough. The partnership between Eisenhower and Montgomery was never easy or particularly warm. They were too different in temperament, background, and philosophy. But it worked well enough to achieve victory, largely because Eisenhower had established at that crucial May 1944 meeting that while he would listen to concerns, accommodate legitimate needs, and respect expertise, he would not tolerate insubordination, disloyalty, or actions that threatened alliance unity. That combination of diplomatic flexibility and iron resolve, when principles were at stake, became Eisenhower's signature as Supreme Commander and later as President of the United States. The broader lesson from this confrontation extends far beyond World War II or military history. Eisenhower faced a situation that leaders in every field encounter: a brilliant but difficult subordinate whose talents are undeniable, but whose behavior threatens to undermine the larger mission. The temptation in such situations is either to appease the difficult person, to keep them happy, or to crush them to assert authority. Eisenhower did neither. He acknowledged Montgomery's legitimate concerns and expertise. He made reasonable accommodations where possible, but he absolutely refused to compromise on fundamental principles of command unity and alliance cohesion. He gave Montgomery a clear choice: operate within the established framework or leave. And he made that choice meaningful by demonstrating genuine willingness to relieve even an indispensable commander if necessary. This approach required enormous confidence, both in his own judgment and in his ability to withstand the political consequences of a difficult decision. It also required the ability to separate personal feelings from professional necessity. Eisenhower never particularly liked Montgomery, but he recognized his value and used him effectively despite their differences. The confrontation also revealed something profound about coalition leadership that remains relevant today. Eisenhower understood that in any partnership of equals, no single party can be allowed to dominate or to pursue its preferences without regard for others' concerns and interests. The Americans had more troops, more resources, and more industrial capacity than the British by 1944, and some American commanders believed this entitled them to call all the shots. Eisenhower rejected this logic, insisting on genuine partnership, where British expertise and experience were respected even as American strength was acknowledged. But partnership required all parties to accept compromise and collective decision-making, which meant that Montgomery couldn't unilaterally revise plans or command structures to suit his preferences any more than American commanders could. This insistence on genuine but bounded partnership, where each nation contributed according to its strengths, but no nation dominated, held the Western Alliance together through victory in Europe and laid foundations for NATO and the post-war transatlantic relationship. As you reflect on this pivotal moment when Eisenhower's words to Montgomery set the course for D-Day and ultimately for Allied victory in Europe, consider what it teaches us about leadership, coalition building, and the courage required to confront difficult people in pursuit of larger purposes. If this story gave you new insight into how history's greatest military operation almost came undone before it began, honor that insight by subscribing to this channel for more hidden chapters from the past. Hit the like button to ensure others can discover these lessons. Share this video with anyone who leads teams or organizations or simply appreciates seeing how great leaders handle impossible situations. And leave a comment telling us what you learned that you didn't know before, or which aspect of the Eisenhower-Montgomery relationship you found most instructive for leadership in your own life. The confrontation between Eisenhower and Montgomery in May 1944 reminds us that the success of great enterprises depends not just on brilliant plans or adequate resources, but on human relationships, on the ability of leaders to manage ego and ambition and competing visions in service of shared objectives, and on the moral courage to enforce standards even when doing so carries enormous risk. Eisenhower's willingness to relieve Montgomery if necessary, even 3 weeks before the largest amphibious invasion in history, demonstrated a commitment to principle over expediency that would characterize his entire career. His ability to combine this firmness with genuine respect for Montgomery's abilities and reasonable accommodation of legitimate concerns showed sophisticated leadership that transcended simple authoritarianism. The Allied victory in Europe, the successful establishment of NATO, and Eisenhower's later success as president all flowed in part from the leadership principles he demonstrated in that private confrontation with a difficult but talented subordinate who needed to understand that brilliance did not exempt anyone from the disciplines required for collective success.